Hematopoietic cells are a type of cell that are crucial for the formation of blood and are found in various parts of the body, including bone marrow and lymphatic tissues. These cells are known for their high proliferation rate, which means they can rapidly divide and produce new cells. This characteristic is essential for maintaining the body's ability to replenish blood cells and support the immune system. Bone marrow, a spongy tissue inside bones, and lymphatic tissues, part of the immune system, both play vital roles in housing these cells and facilitating their growth and function. In contrast, for example, the testis and ovaries are different when compared to the nervous system. That's why you find the extremities, for example, or the recognition of our bodies, because there isn't much high sensitivity. So even when they came to check my eye, they said, okay, the eye is fine. I told you about the hand. 500 millisieverts in real, and in the eye told you 20 millisieverts. Everything is fine. It started to be put down, and you said that the Indian doesn't have a problem. You might be exposed to large parts of radiation. No problem. So let's go back to the topic of cells and cell activity. Are these cells affected or not? Okay. Stochastic, as we were discussing, normal cells can develop into one cancer cell that undergoes proliferation, which can then lead to cancer or leukemia. For example, is this process stochastic or deterministic? The hereditary effects or genetic effects that exist are all types of stochastic effects. So, let's summarize this. Deterministic effects occur after 3 months, and the effects can increase with the dose received, which may manifest after days, weeks, or months, depending on the dose taken. Stochastic effects do not have a 3-month delay, and the probability of their occurrence increases with higher doses. These effects may appear years after exposure and include cancer and genetic mutations. Here it tells you that, for example, if you have skin and this skin is exposed to a dose of 2 gray, it will start to now show erythema from 2 days or from 2 hours to 24 hours. Now, for erythema, if you take a slightly higher dose of 3 to 6 gray, to show the effects, you need 3 to 4 gray. The more you increase the dose, the more I call this a deterministic effect. The dose keeps increasing, and your effect keeps rising. All right, let me tell you a bit more about my past experiences. I used to work in Egypt for a significant period, before I eventually decided to leave. During my time there, I was employed as a radiation protection expert at a well-known company. My role involved ensuring the safety and protection of individuals from harmful radiation exposure, which was a critical responsibility. I gained a lot of valuable experience and knowledge in the field, which has been incredibly beneficial in my career. You find that you have maximum radiation power and energy, for example. And this is a very significant topic where they used an element called iridium. The iridium source had a radiation activity of approximately 50 curies. If someone were to hold it in their hand would suffer from burns, and they would experience intense and severe pain. What happens is that they use a specific device, known as a specialized camera. This camera has a shielding device and contains a radiation source. This shielding device is crucial for safety. This source is supposed to move inside the camera and travel through a cable. This cable is placed on the welding of the petroleum pipes, and it starts to capture detailed images, performing imaging of the weld to check for cracks, in a manner similar to the concept of traditional X-ray work, but here it is in the industrial sector. The source captures images of the weld that connects the gas and petroleum pipelines. Sometimes the source can be extremely small in size, like 2 centimeters, and while moving through the cable, it may stop. The technician who was working wanted to disconnect the stacking that had occurred and remove the source. He started to handle the cable, which was not shielded. As he held the cable, it exposed him to radiation, resulting in an incident in the place where I was. Perhaps someone can explain that the burn or swelling occurred in his hand, and the burn he suffered was an internal burn in the internal tissues. The hand was very red and swollen, and the entire pain was internal, with the skin color changing. due to the radiation's high penetration power. He said that radiation, especially with high penetration power or a large burn, starts to show effects as if it were something with high energy. The energy of the iridium is about 0.5 million neutron volts, so because it has high penetration, the skin does not absorb it, but interacts with the tissues inside. The effect or burn that occurred was as if it were a burn from the inside out. The hand looked fine from the outside, but the problem was inside. If I had these pictures, I would have shown them the strong civilization, and there was a radiological incident at that time. You have surely heard about the radiological incident that happened earlier in Egypt, where a source was lost in a place called 100 Halfa. The radioactive source was still present and someone took it. People were using it while digging lines. It was also a radioactive source used in the industrial field for welding, known as a non-destructive system. The source was placed on a cabinet at home. What happened was that almost everyone in that house died, and it was eventually discovered that this source had been lost from the company, which was Petrojet at that time. The important thing is that there is an effect that occurs, and it is primarily and significantly dependent on the amount of dose received. For example, if you have a barium exposure of 0.5 gray, there will be a depression in the platform formation or the joints. If exposed to 0.15 gray, there will be temporary sterility in the male or permanent sterility if the dose increases to between 3.5 and 6 gray. And this can manifest within 3 weeks of exposure. Of course, if I were to ask you, for example, whether an interventional radiologist could indeed experience temporary or permanent sterility due to exposure, the answer could indeed be yes. Can you imagine that in certain scenarios, the glands might indeed be exposed to 0.15 gray, which is approximately what you would multiply by a factor of 10, resulting in about 150 milligray.
I came back. Who is he?
So the question is, if I am exposed, for example, in interventional radiology, can you imagine that scattered radiation could reach 150 milligrads in the exposure area? This dose is very high, and when we think about it, we would say that this dose is indeed very high. But can it reach that level or not? This depends on the procedure being performed. It is supposed not to happen, but when you find procedures where a user is using or operating in continuous mode at a high dose level with elevated parameters and collimation open, and there is very high scattered radiation, and they are not wearing a lead apron, it can happen. Yes, it can happen. At that time, under the conditions I am talking about, it can happen. Why? Because at that moment, if someone comes in for a regular X-ray, can it happen? No, of course not. What about CT? No, that's also difficult. So we are talking specifically about fluoroscopy, which is one of the areas with high scattered radiation. Unfortunately, many people neglect the lead apron issue. The lead apron actually blocks 99% of the radiation in radiology, so the reduction is very high. No one should say that the lead apron doesn't do anything. Some might say that it weakens or whatever, but as you know, that's wrong. However, they might tell you that if someone has been working for 20 or 30 years and nothing has happened to them, and so on. It means, really, if he moves, he is working on the front and back, doing this with a lead apron of 0.25 on the front and back, or 0.25 in thickness. Is it doing 0.5 millimeters? Yes, doctor. It is possible to do what he is doing. But of course, if it happens, If it happens, then the dose is high. For example, if someone weighs 60 kilograms and receives 4 gray, you will always find whole body exposure if it occurs. For instance, if we say that if there is exposure from 1 to 6 gray, then there is a risk of something like a bone marrow issue, and you might see fatalities after about 3 to 60 days. For the central nervous system, from 5 to 15 gray, it could be 10 to 20 days. And for more than 15 gray, it could be 1 to 5 days. Of course, do you remember these numbers? I myself do not memorize them, but I know their levels. For example, now when you ask me what is important to you, the 3 numbers are certainly related to 100 milligray. This is important. For example, the dose that might occur at a threshold like 2 or 3. 2, for example, above 2 it runs. In my opinion, as a man working in the field, I don't memorize the 0.5 and 0.1 values, you understand? I don't remember the time for the effect, and I don't think the question will come in that way, like asking how many weeks until a certain effect occurs. But you should know the levels. For example, if someone is exposed to 50 mg, can this person develop erythema? You need to know that I'm talking about a range of 150 or above in terms of gray, so my numbers are higher. You understand? The idea is to understand the range. The question won't just be about a specific number you need to provide. You should know, for instance, if someone has developed erythema, and then they give you options like, could this person be exposed to 3 to 6 milligray or 3 to 6 gray? So it would be 3 to 6 gray, and I know it will be in gray, not milligray. You understand what I mean? The key is to understand the level you are working in. The patient may be exposed to radiation after undergoing a diagnostic X-ray, of course. As we said, it's about that, so this won't happen. We're talking about the ordinary, not the work that is. The joints are considered radiosensitive organs in the human body with a 3-shoulder dose for permanent sterility, which is 3.5 gray to 6 gray for males and 2.56 gray for females.
So why, Dr. Islam, is your calculation for the dose done in one session or across several sessions? For example, if a patient underwent a procedure and then had a specific CT scan and then received a significant dose, do you feel that the 100 milligray is considered as a single unit?
Now he has entered the procedure for exposure to all the previous uses. The burn discusses cumulative effects or the impact of cumulative doses. So, to put it simply, the man today had a CT scan, and then a month later he had another CT scan. You gave a period of how long for repair to happen and for the cells and the body to recover. You gave a month. So in this case, do you think the effect of your total dose is like that of a single shot? The different values and parameters that are set here in this context are based on a single exposure. I was exposed to this entire value all at once as a result. We have some topics we discussed regarding radiation quantities and radiation units. As I mentioned, we talked about this quickly in yesterday's episode. If I have a radioactive source, this radioactive source emits radiation. How do I express radioactivity? I express it in terms of activity, meaning the radioactivity is the number of disintegrations per second, the number of decays that will occur per second. This is given a unit called becquerel. I said that if I have 1 decay per second, that is 1 becquerel. I also mentioned that if I have 3.7 times 10 to the power of 10 disintegrations per second, I call that 1 core. Radiation itself, even if I have a person who is not exposed to radiation, the person who is exposed to radiation is like, I gave an example yesterday. I said, if I have a cup of water and I pour it on someone, that water represents the exposure that the person has experienced. Now, I have a definition or term, that is the exposure dose. So what is this exposure? It is that radiation causes ionization in air molecules, and the charge or ions that will be formed per unit mass of air is what I call exposure, which has units of Coulomb per kilogram or Roentgen, and Roentgen is the unit of exposure. I said that not all of this happened to him, so it will be different from this patient or this person who was exposed to a dose. I called this dose the unit of energy, which is joules. So, what did I call it? Well, I have alpha, beta, gamma, neutrons. The effect is different. As we said, alpha is considered to have a significant effect, equivalent to 20 times the effect of others. So, I have alpha equal to 20 and gamma equal to something else. This leads to a new concept called effective dose, which is multiplied by the radiation weighting factor. As we mentioned, each organ has different sensitivity, so I need to create a new definition that reflects sensitivity, taking into consideration sensitivity and the radiation weighting factor. Thus, I created something called effective dose, thinking about the concentrations and also thinking about the concentrations. So, I created something called effect dose, which is what it is about the unit that it has established for itself. If I have and want to calculate exposure to 10 gray, if I want to calculate and refer to the equivalent dose, AST awareness improves the derivative of the dose upon dose exposure. The effective dose of this person. I have a tengri. How much would the equivalent dose be, and what would the effective dose be? How many? If I have a person here now, as you may know, this person was exposed to radiation. Their absorbed dose is 10 milligrams, which is a significant amount. Now, in this context, I want to calculate the equivalent dose and the effective dose to determine the precise values from this 10 millirol.
Well, the actual dose will equal 2 milligrams, and we need to apply the radiation weighting factor. The actual dose will be 1. It should be 10 milligrams. It should be 1. 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 It should be 1.
Is that clear? So, 2 milligray will be 2 millisievert in the equivalent and effective dose for the whole body, right? Is that clear? Can you repeat that? I didn't hear all of it. The difference is from those who started correctly, right, Dr. Islam? With your permission, I have a person. This person has been exposed to radiation. Is that clear? The radiation. Did all the radiation outside this person get absorbed? Or is there a part that might be scattered, with some reaching here and some reaching there? Not all of it, right? Right, exactly. So, the part where exposure occurred, I called it the exposure dose. I called it exposure dose. So what is this exposure? The X-ray causes ionization. It creates something called a post-negative charge in air molecules. All right, the charge that is formed is measured per kilogram of air. This means I took 1 kilogram of air, exposed it to X-ray, and I see how much charge has formed in that kilogram of air. I call this exposure. The more the charge increases, the higher the exposure level. All right, doctor, if the charge decreases, then the charge increases. So the amount of charge gives me an indication of the exposure that occurred. All right, I took a certain number of charges and called it Roentgen to make it easier for me. So Roentgen is the unit of exposure. All right, now I want to calculate the dose that this person received. I say, what is the exact amount of energy? Then it will be precisely on the books. The unit of energy is joules per kilogram, which is a derived unit in the International System of Units. The joule, named after the physicist James Prescott Joule, is used in combination with kilograms for convenience in various scientific calculations. So, what exactly is the unit we are discussing here? What is the unit? All right, doctor. All right. So, I wonder if the effect of an X-ray is the same as if I have a source of alpha particles, or a source of neutrons, or a source of protons? No. The effect is different. So I have a new definition, or a new item, or a new factor called irradiation weighting factor, a type of irradiation. For X-rays, gamma, and beta, the effect of alpha particle is equivalent in effect to 20 times that of X-rays, gamma, and beta. This essentially means that in order to calculate the dose, you need to take into account the equivalent dose, which is the absorbed dose, multiplied by the radiation weighting factor with its unit being sievert. But we are not done yet. The whole body as a whole is not the same. Each organ has different sensitivities. Therefore, it is necessary to include the tissue sensitivity factor to determine the dose. Calculate for me something called the effective dose. What is this effective dose? It is the equivalent dose multiplied by the tissue sensitivity factor, which is a factor that has a specific value for each organ. Is that clear? The unit for it is sievert. So sievert is the same unit as the equivalent. In this particular scenario, if I have a person who has specifically received a dose of 10 milligray, then I am specifically talking about the effective dose, and I want to accurately calculate the equivalent dose. What should I do in this case? I will need to multiply this value by a specific radiation weighting factor. Since the type of radiation in question is X-ray, I will multiply by how much exactly? For alpha particle radiation, I will multiply by how much exactly? 20, right? Okay, I want to calculate this now. I ended up with 10 milligray when talking about X-ray, and it will be 20 times 10, which is 200, right? No, it will be more than 200. It will be 200 millisievert for the alpha particle. The effective dose is calculated as a product of the tissue sensitivity factor. Each organ in the body has a specific tissue sensitivity factor associated with it. So when I want to say I want to calculate the effective dose for the whole body, it is the same as the equivalent dose. What is the equivalent dose? When I want to calculate for a specific organ, I will take the weighting factor for that organ and multiply it by the effective dose. For example, if I have a patient who had a CT scan of the chest, how do I calculate the dose for this person? You will find on the machine something called DLP dose length product, which is measured in milligray per centimeter, meaning the dose received during the imaging of the chest from here.